The thing that woke me wasn't a number. It was the absence of one. I run night-side diagnostics for a regional sleep telemetry network, 7 clinics, 340 active beds, all feeding into a central aggregation server I babysit from a windowless room in the basement of the Hartwell Institute. My job is unglamorous and exact. Polysomnography data comes in from every monitored patient: brain waves, eye movement, muscle tone, heart rate, oxygen saturation, the small electrical weather of a sleeping human being. I don't read it for meaning. I make sure it arrives clean, time-stamped, and uncorrupted, and I flag anything the automated systems can't reconcile. I am, in the most literal sense, a janitor of other people's nights. I'm good at it. 11 years. I know the shape of normal sleep the way a mechanic knows the sound of a healthy engine. I can look at a hypnogram, the staircase graph of a person descending through sleep stages and climbing back up, and tell you within a glance whether the night was ordinary. Most are. People are reassuringly the same when unconscious. They cycle. They drift. They surface. At 2:14 on a Tuesday in late October, I noticed that bed 112 at our Eastgate clinic had stopped producing variants. That's the wrong detail. Not an alarm. Not a flat line. The patient's vitals were fine, heart steady, breathing regular, oxygen good. What had stopped was the noise. Every real recording carries a baseline of microfluctuation, the tiny imperfect jitter of biology and instrumentation. A sleeping brain never produces a clean line. It can't. There's always drift. Always the analog smear of a living system. Bed 112's REM signature had gone smooth. Not flat, smooth. The waveform during dream sleep had the texture of something rendered rather than recorded. I'd seen artifacts before: electrode failures, signal bleed, a loose lead producing garbage. This wasn't garbage. It was too good. It looked like a reference file. Like the textbook diagram of REM you'd show a first-year tech, idealized and impossibly clean. I pulled the raw stream and ran it against the calibration suite. Everything checked out. The hardware was reporting honest values. The smoothness wasn't an instrument error. It was in the patient. I made a note in the anomaly log, attached the segment, and tagged it for the morning shift. Standard. Then I did the thing I always do when something bothers me, which is to look at the neighbors. I pulled the REM segments from beds 108 through 116 at Eastgate. 3 of them were smooth too. Not identical. I want to be precise about that, because precision is the only thing that kept me sane in the weeks that followed. They weren't copies. Each had its own amplitude, its own duration, its own placement in the night. But they all shared that rendered quality, that absence of the analog smear. For patients, in 4 separate rooms, who had never met, were producing dream state data with the same impossible cleanliness. I told myself it was the new firmware. We'd pushed an update to the Eastgate acquisition units in September. Software smooths things. Maybe a filter was running where it shouldn't, scrubbing the signal before it reached me. That was a clean explanation. And clean explanations are what you reach for at 2 in the morning when you'd rather be reaching for nothing at all. I filed it. I went home. I slept, and if I dreamed, I don't remember it, which at the time meant nothing to me and which I would later come to think about a great deal. The morning tech, Priya, was good. She caught my flag, checked the firmware theory, and killed it by lunch. The September update touched the storage pipeline, not the acquisition layer. Nothing in the signal path could have produced what I'd seen. She wrote back, "No smoothing filter exists upstream of you. If it's clean before it hits the wire." Weird. Escalating to Voss. Voss was the clinical director. I'd met him twice. He had the careful effect of a man who'd spent his career around people in distress and had filed his own reactions somewhere safe. He sent a 2-line email thanking us for our diligence and informing us that Bed 112 and the others were part of a protocol-adjacent cohort, and that their data would be routed separately going forward. He asked us not to flag them again. That should have been the end of it. A director invokes a protocol. The data leaves your purview, you move on. There are always cohorts you don't have visibility into: drug trials, sealed studies, things with consent forms thicker than the procedures they describe. Privacy walls are normal. Being told to stop looking is normal. What wasn't normal was that the data didn't actually leave. It was supposed to be routed to a separate partition, walled off from the general aggregation pool. I checked, the way you check a thing you've been told to forget. The flagged beds were still writing to the main server. The separate routing was a label, not a wall. Someone had changed the metadata so the records wouldn't surface in our anomaly queue, but the bits were still flowing into the same storage I maintained. I understood that as carelessness. An overworked admin checks a box. The box does less than advertised. The data ends up where it always was. I've cleaned up after that kind of thing 100 times. So I did what any competent person does with a misconfiguration. I started documenting it, intending to fix it. And documenting it meant reading it. The smooth REM segments had a structure I hadn't noticed in the rush of the first night. When you decompose a dream state EEG into its frequency components, you get a spread, a messy distribution of activity across bands, the brain's many regions chattering at once. These segments had a spread too, but the chatter wasn't random. There were recurring motifs. Short sequences of activity that repeated, with variation, across the 4 patients. Like 4 musicians improvising around the same melody without having heard it. I am not a neuroscientist. I want to be honest about the limits of what I could know. But I am a pattern person and a network person, and I know what it looks like when separate endpoints are receiving from a common source. It looks exactly like this. 4 terminals, 4 screens, slightly different rendering, same underlying feed. I told myself, coincidence. The brain is finite. Dreams must reuse motifs the way languages reuse phonemes. Of course there's overlap. Of course 4 people might, by chance, share a fragment. Then I widened the query. I shouldn't have been able to. The flagged cohort was 4 beds at 1 clinic. But since the data had never actually left the main pool, I could run the same decomposition across everything. All 340 beds, all 7 clinics, the whole network's previous 30 nights of REM. It was a heavy job. I queued it overnight and went home and didn't sleep well, though again I couldn't tell you why. In the morning the results were waiting, and the floor of my understanding quietly gave way. It wasn't for patience. The motif, the recurring melodic structure in dream sleep, was present in 61 of them, across all 7 clinics. People separated by 100 miles, by age, by diagnosis, by every variable I could think to control for. 61 strangers, over the past month, had begun sharing fragments of the same dream architecture. And the sharing was increasing. 30 days ago it appeared in 2. Now 61. The line, when I graphed it, was not linear. It curved upward the way an infection curves upward. I sat with that for a long time. Then I did the thing I'd been avoiding, which was to check my own clinic staff cohort. We monitor ourselves, a small wellness study opt-in, 6 employees including me. We wear the lightweight home units. I pulled my own 30 nights. The motif was in mine. It had appeared 11 nights ago. It was getting stronger. I need to tell you about my brother now, because this is where the wound starts to fit the wound in the world, and I would rather you understand it cleanly than discover it the way I did. Daniel died 4 years ago. He was younger than me by 6 years, and he did not die suddenly. He died over about 18 months, of something that began in his sleep and ended everywhere. Early on, before anyone understood it as illness, he described his dreams to me. He'd always been a vivid dreamer, but in that last stretch they changed. He said they stopped feeling like his. He said it was as if you were being shown the same place, night after night, and that each night he understood a little more of how to get there, and that the understanding frightened him in a way the place itself did not. I was the practical brother. I told him it was stress. I told him to sleep with the lights off and stop drinking coffee after noon and see someone if it got worse. I gave him operational advice for a problem that was not operational, because operational advice was what I had, and because I could not stand to sit inside his fear with him. He stopped describing the dreams to me after a while. I told myself he'd gotten better. He'd simply stopped telling me, because I'd made it clear I wasn't a safe place to put it. I have carried that since. Not the grief. Grief I can manage. Grief is just love that has nowhere to go. What I carry is the specific shape of having had a door open and having closed it because I didn't know what to do with what was on the other side. I had never connected my work to Daniel. They were separate countries. My job was clean signals and uptime. Daniel was a wound I'd learned to walk around. But sitting in that basement, looking at 61 strangers and myself converging on a shared dream, what I heard in my own head was my brother's voice, for years dead, saying it's the same place every night, and I'm learning the way. I want to be clear that I did not, at that point, believe anything supernatural. I believed I'd found a real phenomenon, a contagious or environmental influence on dream content, something with a physical cause, transmissible or shared, that the Institute knew about and was tracking under a protocol they didn't want their basement technician examining. That was already enormous. That was already a thing worth losing sleep over. I did not need ghosts. I needed an explanation, and the institution had one, and they were keeping it from me. So I went to Voss. I didn't go in hot. You don't with a man like that, and besides I wanted information more than I wanted to be right. I brought the graph. I said I'd found a shared motif spreading across the network, that it was in 61 patients and accelerating, and that I wanted to understand the cohort I'd been told to stop flagging so I could rule out a data integrity problem on my end. He looked at the graph for longer than he needed to. Then he asked me a question that wasn't about the graph. "How are you sleeping?" I said fine. He nodded like I'd confirmed something. He told me the cohort was part of a study into convergent sleep phenomena, that it was real, that it was being handled at a level above both of us, and that my data integrity was not in question. The signals were exactly what they appeared to be. He said the word exactly the way you'd hand someone a sealed box. Then he told me to route the flagged beds to cold storage and stop running network-wide decomposition jobs, because they were consuming resources the study needed. I asked him what was causing it. He said, "We're not certain it's caused. We're considering that it might be received." I asked what that meant. He said the meeting was over, and thanked me again for my diligence, and I understood that diligence was the thing he most wanted to stop. I left with less than I came in with, except for that one word. Received. It sat in me like a stone. Caused implies a source you can find and shut off. Received implies a transmission, and a transmitter, and the unbearable question of who is sending. I should have stopped. I want that on the record. I had a direct instruction, a sealed study, a director who clearly knew more than he'd say, and a phenomenon that was, by every rational measure, none of my business. The healthy thing, the thing the man who'd given his dying brother sleep hygiene tips would have done, was to route the data and look away. I didn't look away. And the reason I didn't was Daniel, though I dressed it up as professional curiosity for another week before I could admit it. If this thing had a beginning, if it could be traced, then maybe what took my brother had a beginning too, and maybe the door I'd closed had been the wrong response to something that was actually happening to him, something real, something I might have helped with if I'd believed him instead of managing him. So I kept the decomposition job running. I just hit it better. The motif kept spreading. By the second week, it was in 140 of our beds. I started cross-referencing against the timestamps, trying to find patient 0, the first appearance in the whole network. The data only went back so far. Our retention policy purges raw streams after 90 days, but within that window I could chase it backward. The earliest clean instance was not at Eastgate, where I'd first seen it. It was at our oldest clinic, Marrow Hill, a converted sanatorium on the north edge of the county, in a single patient, 87 nights ago. From there it had radiated outward, clinic by clinic, in a pattern that tracked almost perfectly with physical proximity and shared staff. It moved like something with a vector. It moved like contact. I requested the patient record for the Marrow Hill Index case. The request was denied, not by a person, by the system. The record existed, but my credentials, which could read every byte of telemetry on the network, could not open the demographic file. A technician who can read your brainwaves but not your name. I'd never hit that wall before. Someone had built it recently, and built it specifically around this. I could not read the name. But I could read the telemetry, because the telemetry was mine. So I pulled 87 nights of that patient's sleep and watched the motif being born. It did not arrive fully formed. The first night it appeared as a flicker, a few seconds of that rendered smoothness in an otherwise ordinary dream cycle, like a single clear note in static. The second night, longer. By the second week, the patient's REM was almost entirely smooth, almost entirely the motif, and their sleep architecture had reorganized itself around it. Their normal cycles had degraded. They were spending more and more of the night in that state. And here is the detail that stopped my breath. Their total sleep time was increasing. Night over night, the patient slept longer. As if the dream were holding them down. As if leaving had become difficult. The last night of telemetry for the Marrow Hill Index case showed 11 hours of sleep, almost all of it in the smooth state, ending not with a normal wake transition but with a clean cessation. Not a flatline crash. A graceful ramp down, vitals declining in an orderly sequence, like a system being shut off correctly. The patient had died in their sleep, and the record of that death had the same rendered quality as the dream. It looked designed. I matched the date against the obituaries for the county. 87 nights of telemetry, ending on a Thursday. There had been a death at Marrow Hill that Thursday. The local paper ran 2 lines. A retired schoolteacher, no surviving family, passed peacefully in her sleep. That was the midpoint, though I didn't have a word for it then. Up to that moment I'd been chasing a contagion, something spreading, something to be contained, a public health problem with a center. What the index case showed me was that the spreading was not the disease. The spreading was the symptom. The motif wasn't moving from person to person like a cold. Each person was being individually drawn into the same place, at the same pace, following the same arc ending, if uninterrupted, at the same destination. The schoolteacher hadn't been first because she infected the others. She'd been first because she was furthest along. The rest of us were behind her on the same road. 61, then 140, then more. Not a chain of transmission but a cohort of arrivals, cued by how long ago each of us had taken the first step. And I'd taken mine 11 nights ago. I checked the schoolteacher's arc against mine, aligning them by the strength of the motif rather than by calendar date. The curves matched. I could read my own future off a dead woman's chart. If the arc held, I had somewhere between 5 and 7 weeks before my sleep reorganized completely. Before I started sleeping longer. Before I stopped surfacing. I did not panic. I want to be accurate about my own state, because the temptation in telling this is to make myself more frightened than I was, and the truth is colder. I felt the specific calm of a man who has finally found the edges of the thing that has been shapeless his whole adult life. Daniel had described it. The same place every night, and I'm learning the way. He had not been ill in the way they decided he was. Or he had. But the illness was this, was a version of this, had a vector and an arc and an institution that for years later had a protocol for it. They had known. Maybe not then, maybe not in his specific case, but the institute had a sealed study with the word received in it, and somewhere in their cold storage there might be 87 nights of my brother's sleep with a flicker on night 1. I requested Daniel's old records. He'd been a patient here briefly, in the early period, before the diagnosis took its final shape. The request returned a result, and then while I watched, the result withdrew itself. Access revoked, mid-session, by someone watching me watch. A line of text in the audit log, my own query, and beside it a second entry I hadn't generated, access reviewed. Present tense. Someone was in the system with me, in real time, closing doors as I opened them. That was when I understood that the institutional silence around this was not bureaucratic. It was active. Voss's calm, the fake routing, the credential wall built specifically around the index case, the live revocation of my brother's file, these weren't the dropped balls of an overworked organization. They were the careful, quiet movements of people who knew exactly what they were sitting on and had decided that the correct response was to let it continue while keeping anyone from describing it out loud. I went to Voss again. This time I went hot, because I had stopped being able to afford patience. I told him I knew the motif was an arc, not a contagion. I told him I'd read the index case to its end. I told him I was on the same curve and that, by my math, so was he, because he'd answered, "How are you sleeping?" like a man checking his own weather. I told him I wanted to know what was at the end of it, and whether anyone had ever come back. He was quiet for a while. Then he did something I didn't expect. He didn't deny it. He poured 2 cups of bad coffee and told me to sit, and he talked in the flat institutional cadence of a man who had clearly given some version of this speech before and hated it each time. He said the Institute had been documenting the phenomenon for longer than the network had existed, that the telemetry was only the latest instrument, that before the machines there had been notebooks, and before the notebooks there had been the sanatorium at Marrow Hill, which had been built where it was built for a reason no one alive could fully reconstruct. He said the phenomenon was not new and not local. He said that for as long as there were records, there had been clusters of people in proximity who began to share a dream, and who followed it inward, and who, at the end, slept and did not wake, peacefully, gracefully, correctly. He said the word correctly the way he'd said exactly, like handing me a second sealed box. I asked what was sending it. He said that was the wrong question, the one that destroyed everyone who asked it, and that the Institute's entire purpose was to keep people from asking it long enough to do the only useful thing, which was to count and map and slow it where they could. I asked how you slow it, and he told me the part that I have not been able to set down since. You slow it, he said, by interruption. The arc requires uninterrupted progression. Every night in the smooth state advances you. Every night of ordinary, broken, ugly human sleep sets you back. The people who plateau, who never reach the end, are the ones whose sleep is bad, insomniacs, shift workers, the grief-stricken, the anxious, the people in pain. The healthier your sleep, the faster you go. The schoolteacher had slept beautifully her whole life. That was why she'd been first. The Institute's intervention, the thing it actually did with its sealed protocol and its careful silence, was to identify people on the arc and ruin their sleep. Quietly. Without telling them why. A medication that fragments REM, handed out as something else. A change in their environment. A stressor introduced. A comfort removed. They kept people alive by keeping them tired and frightened and unwell, indefinitely, because the alternative was the graceful correct shutdown, and because no one had ever found a third option. I asked him about Daniel. He didn't pretend not to know the name. He said my brother had been an early identified case, before the network, before the methods were refined. He said that in those days the only intervention they had was crude, that they'd made his sleep worse the only ways they knew how, and that it had slowed him but not stopped him, and that the 18 months I'd watched my brother decline had been 18 months the Institute had bought him, by methods I'd interpreted as the illness itself. The dreams that weren't his. The fear. The way he'd stopped being able to rest. Some of that had been the arc. And some of it, Voss said, evenly had been them. I understood, sitting there with the bad coffee going cold, that I had spent 4 years carrying the guilt of the closed door, the brother I'd managed instead of believed, and that the door had never been the thing. There had been no version of me, no amount of belief or presence, that would have changed his arc. The institution had already been in the room. They had been fragmenting his sleep while I was telling him to cut back on coffee. We had been, the two of us, applying the same crude tool from opposite sides of the wall, and neither of us had known, and it had bought him a 1.5 years of suffering that I had read as my failure to save him. I don't know how to describe what that did to me except to say that it took my grief, which I had at least understood, and replaced it with something I had no procedure for. Voss let me sit with it. Then he told me why he'd finally talked. He was further along than I was. His own arc was nearly complete. He'd been ruining his own sleep for years, deliberately, the way the saints of this thing did, and he could not keep it up much longer. The body cannot run forever on fragmented nights and dread, and he needed someone who understood the systems to take over the counting and the mapping and the quiet sabotage after he was gone. He was not offering me a way out. There was no way out. He was offering me his job. The real one. The one underneath the one I thought I had. And then he gave me the choice, which was the only choice this thing has ever offered anyone, and which I will now carry for whatever is left of my life. I could refuse. I could sleep well. I could let the arc run, and in 5 to 7 weeks I would lie down on a healthy night and follow the same place inward and shut down, correctly, gracefully, and reach the end the schoolteacher reached, and find out the answer to the question Voss said destroyed everyone who asked it. I could go where Daniel went. There was, he admitted, no evidence that the end was bad. The records only showed that it was final. It might be peace. It might be arrival. It might be the most natural thing in the world, the thing sleep has always been pretending toward. He would not tell me it was hell. He would only tell me that no one had ever come back to file a report, and that an institution cannot be built on a destination no one returns from. Or I could stay. I could take his place. I could begin that night to destroy my own sleep on purpose forever, to live the rest of my life tired, fragmented, frightened, deliberately denying myself the one thing that would complete me, in order to keep counting the others and keep ruining their nights too. To do to 140 strangers, and then more, what the Institute had done to my brother. To become the hand that fragmented their rest without telling them why, that handed out the medication labeled as something else, that introduced the stressor and removed the comfort. To save them the only way anyone had ever found, which was to make them suffer indefinitely instead of letting them arrive. There was no clean version. To refuse was to abandon 140 people to a death they hadn't chosen and didn't know was coming. To accept was to spend my life inflicting the exact suffering I'd spent 4 years grieving in my brother, on people who would never know I was the reason their sleep had gone bad, who would think, as I had thought of Daniel, that the wrongness was simply happening to them. I asked Voss if he believed he'd done the right thing. He said he'd stopped using that frame a long time ago. He said the only thing he knew was that the people he'd sabotaged were alive, and that being alive was the only outcome he had the tools to produce, and that he had decided alive and suffering was a thing he was permitted to choose for other people because the alternative was a door he wasn't willing to push them through. He said it without warmth and without apology. He said it like a man reading a maintenance log. I took the job. I want to tell you I agonized longer. I didn't. I had read my brother's arc in a dead schoolteacher's chart, and I had felt the pull of that place in my own 11-day flicker, the faint sweetness of it, the way it wanted to be reached, and I knew that if I let myself sleep well even once I would feel it grow, and I knew that the kindest sounding option, the peaceful correct shutdown, was exactly the thing that had taken Daniel, and I could not be the one to wave 140 people toward it just because I lacked the stomach to make them miserable. I chose the misery. Theirs and mine. I chose to become the thing in the wall. That was 19 days ago. I don't sleep more than 3 hours at a stretch now, and I've engineered it that way. The cold room, the interruptions, the small chemical helpers Voss left me, the deliberate cultivation of a low-grade dread that I no longer have to manufacture because it lives in me now on its own. My own motif has weakened. The arc has slowed. I have bought myself time, and I spend the time buying it for others, reaching into the telemetry every night to find the new flickers, the night one cases, and reaching into their lives the only way I'm able, a flag here, a quiet recommendation routed through a clinician who thinks they're treating insomnia, a medication, a stressor, a removed comfort. I make strangers' nights worse. I am very good at my job. I have always been very good at my job. Voss died 11 days ago. He slept well once, on purpose, at the end. He left a note that said only that he'd earned it, and I have not decided whether I believe him or whether the place simply got him the way it gets everyone who stops fighting, and I have realized that not being able to tell the difference is itself part of what this work costs. I think about Daniel every night, in the long fragmented dark, in the hours I keep myself awake. I used to think the worst thing I'd done to him was close the door, manage him, give him sleep hygiene tips instead of belief. I know now the door was never the failure. The failure is the one I'm committing right now, on purpose, on 140 strangers and counting, in rooms I'll never see, to people who will go to their graves believing their bad sleep was just bad luck. I save them by becoming the thing I couldn't forgive. Every night I'm more certain it's the only option and less certain it's not just the schoolteacher's piece dressed up as duty, a way of arriving slowly, through other people, instead of all at once. The phenomenon hasn't stopped. It was here before the machines, and it will be here after me, and someone will have to take this chair when my knights finally win, and I will leave them a note, and I already know it will say the same thing Voss has said, because there is nothing else true to write. I keep the others awake. I keep myself awake. The counting continues. And somewhere underneath all of it, in the smooth, clean place that wants me, my brother is still learning the way, and I have understood, too late to do anything with the understanding that he was never lost. He arrived. I'm the one who stayed in the dark on purpose, holding the door shut with my whole life, for people who will never know the door was there.